Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how I made this bow saw that I plan to use for cutting out dovetail waste and sawing all kinds of curved parts. This project doesn't require a lot of lumber, so I'm going with something a little bit nicer and using figured maple. I'll start by cleaning up both faces of the board, making sure to remove any mill marks or tear out. Next I'll clamp the board up in my vise and start to clean up the edges. Same thing here, I'm still trying to just get rid of the mill marks from the lumber yard, and once I think I have everything right, I'll check it with my combination square to make sure that the edges are square to the fence. The hardware and the blades for the saw come in a kit from Tools for Working Wood and cost about $30. I'm also using their free plans to get the rough dimensions, and then I'll make some modifications to make it look a little bit more like some of the antiques and stuff I've seen in magazines and online. Because there's so much tension on the saw when it's tightened and in use, one of the most important parts of the build is to make sure that the frames are laid out with a grain direction that either complements the tension or is fairly straight. So here I'm just finding the best parts of this board to use, and I'll lay out for the frames, and then I'll repeat the process for the center stretcher. Once all the layout's complete, the board can be ripped down to a more manageable size, and then all the parts cut to their rough length. I'm using a shooting board and a hand plane to clean up the ends and get them to their final length, and then I'll clamp the boards up in my vise and plane away any of the saw marks left over from ripping them down. This isn't completely necessary, but I like to have a nice clean surface for the layout work. Here I'm just using the templates that I cut out earlier to trace the shape on both frames and the center stretcher. There needs to be a 1/4 inch hole at the bottom of each frame that accepts the pin that the blade sits in and the handle. And I'm drilling those out at the drill press while the parts are still square. The stretcher goes into the frames using a mortise and tenon, and so here I'm just setting up my mortising gauge, and I can set the lines up on my frame. Next, I'll use a wheel marking gauge to set the depth of the tenon on the stretcher. Then I can come back with my mortising gauge and set the position and the width of the tenon. The mortise and tenon on the frame and stretcher are going to have a gentle curve, and here I'm just laying those out with a compass. Now I can start chopping out the mortise. I'm using a mortising chisel for this, and I'll just take a few light passes to set the final depth, and I'll leave a little bit of material at each line or each end of the mortise, and then come back in at the end and clean that up. And this just eliminate any type of bruising from the rest of the frame when I'm prying on it with a chisel. Now I'm ready to cut out the rough shape of the frame. And there are a lot of ways to do this. If you were wanting to use just hand tools, you could use a fret saw or coping saw. You could use a combination of hand saws and mallets and chisels, but I decided in this case to just use my bandsaw. Once the frame parts are roughed out on the bandsaw, I'll clamp them up in my vise and use a combination of spoke shaves and rasps to clean up the inside curves and the outside curves. I'm not trying to get them perfect, I'm just really trying to refine the shape, figure out what looks good to me. I decided before I get too far down the path of shaping the frames that it would be a good idea to go ahead and cut out the tenon for the stretchers. So here I'm just using a back saw to cut down to the mortise gauge lines that I created earlier. And to cut out the curved part of the tenon, I'm just going to use a chisel. And I'll pare off the corners, trying to stay close to my layout lines. And then those will create corners that I'll also pare down to. And I'll just keep working away the tenon like that until I have that good gentle curve. Once I have all the material pared away from end to end on the tenon, I'll come back in with a back saw and create two small little haunches so that it'll fit in the mortise of the frames. And then I'll just use a chisel to pare away any extra material and make everything nice and smooth. And once I have everything cleaned up, I'll test fit the stretcher into the frame and make sure I have a good fit. This next step turned out to be the most time-consuming part of the build. I needed to create the inside curved surface of the frame to match the tenon on the stretcher. And so to do that, I used a card scraper and a rasp and a file and just slowly worked my way down, kept test fitting the tenon on the stretcher until I had a good even fit all the way around. Once all the mortise and tenon work is done, I could bring my attention back to refining the shape of the saw. And to do that, I'm going to put one of the frame sides into my vise, use a combination of a scraper, file, and rasp to refine all the curves and get the shape exactly the way I want it. Once I finished shaping the first frame, I clamped both of them up in my vise and used the outline of the first one to shape the second. Once I was finished with the overall shaping of the sides and both parts matched, then I could really start to get into reducing the thickness of the sides, creating a little bit of carving, giving it that good antique feel, and making it feel a little bit lighter and airy. I used a combination of a lot of tools. You can see everything laid out here on the bench to really create the three dimensions of the frame. Carving gouges to lay out radiuses and define the raised sections, and then spoke shaves and card scrapers along with rasps and files to take away the material on the ends, make the tapers, clean everything up. Here I'm using a rasp to round over the bottom ends where the handles are going to go. And once all the shaping's done, I'll clean up all the radiuses and hard curves with some 220 and 320 grit sandpaper. The last step to shaping the sides or the frames is to round over all the edges and sides. I'm going to be using this a lot. I don't want there to be any sharp edges for my hands to rub on, so I'll spend some time making sure that everything's rounded over and comfortable. Once the frames are all finished up, I'll repeat all the same processes with all the same tools on the stretcher. Tools for Working Wood sells a version of the bow saw kit that comes with the handles. I believe they're made of cherry, so depending on the species that you're using, they might not match perfectly, but it's a good option if you don't have the lathe. I really wanted these to be made of the same figured maple that I made the rest of the saw out of, and I love the opportunity to use the lathe anytime I can, so I decided to make these myself. To make the handles, I cut out a rough piece of maple at the bandsaw and then chucked it up in the lathe. I drew some layout lines that will define where the curves of the handle are going to go, and then I used a parting tool to cut everything down to the proper depth. After using a roughing gouge to get the rough shape of the handle, I came back in with a spindle gouge to refine all the shapes and curves and round over all the edges. To get a hole drilled right in the center of the handle, I used a 1/4 inch drill bit and a Jacob's chuck mounted to my tailstock. Once the hole is drilled, I could put the tailstock back into place and sand everything smooth with some 220 grit and 320 grit sandpaper. Once I got the handle off the lathe and cleaned up, I used some 5-minute epoxy to install the pin that'll hold the blade and go through the frame. The part that you use to wrap the thread tight and tension the saw is called the toggle, and here I am at the lathe just cutting out the rough shape for that. Once everything's cut, sanded smooth, I'll take it off the lathe and then start to hand plane in some flats. I decided to take down all four sides just to make this part as light as possible, and I kind of like the look of the four equal sides. Now I'm ready for finish, and I really wanted to make the curly or maple figure pop on this. So to do that, I'm applying a liberal amount of aniline dye, and this is a mix, I think, of golden ember and maybe brown mahogany, and I'm going to put it on all the parts and let it dry for about 30 minutes. Once the dye's had some time to dry, I'm going to come back and sand away most of it with 320 grit sandpaper. When I'm finished with this, the only part that'll have dye in it is the end grain or the curly figured part of the maple. Once all the parts are cleaned up, then I'll mix up a lighter version of the dye and apply it to all the parts and let it dry. Once the second coat of dye has had a lot of time to completely dry out, I'll use a combination of 4-aught steel wool and a gray Scotch-Brite pad to buff out or even burnish the parts of the frame saw. And when you're doing this, you'll really start to see that end grain or figured grain of the maple pop out. Once the parts are all sanded smooth and burnished, I'll apply a thin coat of boiled linseed oil to all the parts and let it dry overnight. The last part of the process is to use 4 or 5 coats of a thin down or a 1-pound cut shellac. I sand with a 400 grit sandpaper between every other coat, and then I use some steel wool and some paste wax to knock back the finish and give all the parts that nice even low luster. After giving the wax a few minutes to dry, I'll buff everything out with a microfiber towel and the parts look amazing. This is a great finish technique to get that really good antique look on figured maple. And the last step is to get the saw assembled and give it a test drive. I'll start by putting the handles on and getting the blade set, and then I'll use this string that I also picked up for Tools for Working Wood for like $5. And then once I got it home, I realized that this is just braided fishing line, and I had tons of it laying around the house I should have just used. But anyways, I'll get that strung up on the saw, install the toggle, and get everything tightened up. And with everything buttoned up on this project, the only thing left to do was to take a couple of test cuts. I have to admit, guys, this saw works flawlessly. It outperforms any of the turning saws, coping saws, or fret saws I've used in the past, including some very expensive anodized aluminum ones. So I'm super stoked that I made it. I can't wait to use it on future projects, and I hope you guys really liked the video. And if you did, I hope you consider giving it a thumbs up, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel.